So, I am Kim Howard. I work for Kentucky Autism Training Center. I come at science standards from a teacher perspective, right? From a special ed teacher. I'm not a science expert by any means, but I do very much like science and have spent some time as um, doing a lot of different STEM activities with a large variety of kids. So, we're going to walk through some tips um, specifically for that. I'm going to turn my video off, but I'm going to walk you through just some tips and getting started. I did alternate assessment for many years, probably 14 plus years in the classroom as the special ed teacher who was responsible for alternate assessment. So I feel your pain. I started way back when alternate assessment was 500 or 600 pages long, right? You submitted a huge document, and it wasn't this specific, like we're taking a test variety. So I have seen alternate assessment through its many stages of life. So I'm going to talk you through we're going to start with some tips, broad tips that I had not considered when I first started giving this particular type of assessment was we have to teach the testing format. Um, general ed classrooms have built-in lessons throughout the year that they are teaching the testing format. And I hate to say that we need to take our valuable time to do that, but unfortunately, we very much do need to figure out how do we incorporate that similar testing format to our everyday lessons. We don't have to do it constantly. One of the things that I did was think about how am I going to give this alternate assessment. In my classroom, I had students that I could pull out, they sent the lovely testing packet. I could pull that out. I followed obviously all the legal protocols and standards required by alternate assessment, but I could just utilize that direct packet. I did not need to make significant adjustments or modifications, meaning I needed to cut material apart. I needed to present the testing material um, in an alternative form. For some of my students, though, I very much did. For my students who fell under autism level 3, or for my students who had extensive support needs, I needed to adapt the way that I gave that testing format. So I don't know how you all do. One of the things that I did was think through how am I giving this test? The first year that we did this format, meaning they are sending you an actual test that you're going to give and you're not submitting a large portfolio. Um, when I gave the test, I had not prepared my students, the entire year. We had taught the lessons, but I did not teach them how to take a test. And so what I found after that first year and first experience was I have to build in points throughout my school year that I am presenting that information to them in a similar format, um, as then they are going to take that alternate assessment at the end of the year. So it's not such a shock to their system. It's not such a shock because part of taking a test is understanding the format. So it becomes something that we have to consider and teach. And I know that's not science related necessarily. That's whole related. So I have had people that I have supported over the years, they present their alternate assessment. They put it up on their smart board. It's students who do better. The other students are out of the classroom. They're still meeting the testing format, right? They're still meeting all the rules of privacy for the testing format, but they are enlarging that up onto their smart board. So then the student is standing at the smart board and touching the picture or touching the correct answer on the smart board. Because for that student, the smart board was a much easier feature, and they enjoyed doing that versus a pencil paper test. I have had students that when the testing material came to me, I cut apart the answers, right? So they were not able to look at a whole entire page of information. So for them, their answer format, I cut it each one. At that time, we had 4 answers, right? I think now, is it 3 answers? Then we all had 4 answers. I believe you all have 3 now. So I would cut mine apart. I would lay them out in ABC fashion, meeting all the testing standards, but then I would ask that student to touch or hand me whatever their answer was. So think about that. However you're going to give this test for your specific students, give them some practice across the course of the year, right? Just something to think about as you go throughout your year. It made a big difference for my students and just for everyone in getting more comfortable with just dealing with and taking the test format itself. So think about how you're going to introduce vocabulary concepts. For me, many of my students, I introduced everything through matching and we matched picture to picture, we matched picture to vocabulary words. And with picture to vocabulary words, they are doing that with another adult, a classroom assistant with me, and we are saying we're reading those words to them and prompting them to help them make those matches. Maybe it's file folder activities. I love those. I will say that my last several years in the classroom, I taught K through sixth grade. And then a couple of my last years, I just had 3 through 7th grade. And those years, one of those, a couple of those years, I had 12 plus kids. My largest year, I had 14 alternate assessment students that I supported that were on my caseload. So know that you can you can handle a lot. One of the ways that I did that was we build file folder activities, right? I did a lot of structured teaching. So structured teaching is I'm presenting things in a systematic way. For me, it was a tool to help some of my most significantly, my extensive support needs students be able to access learning. And so file folder activities was something that they could do in a workstation or a teacher-based workstation. Um, I made file folder activities for all of the standards. And the nice thing about file folder activities is they don't go away, right? You have them forever, or for as long as you can find all of your pieces. So that was one of the formats that we went to and did. Um, we also I included my younger students. So for my third graders, they participated in fourth grade, my fourth grade science lessons, right? I started teaching that a few years out, right? Some of those skills, and we're talking about scaffolding. I didn't do the exact same lesson every year. We changed it up and did different things, but I included my younger kids in my science and my social studies. I included them. Whoever was in that classroom with me during that time, they participated when I taught that lesson. And I'm going to say I like science, and some of those standards are pretty fun. There's some pretty cool things that you can do with those, a lot of hands-on activities that are good for a lot of kids. So incorporate your younger grades if possible, if it's appropriate, and you're not having to pull them from other activities. Include them a few years ahead because you're teaching them those skills, and you can use a lot more scaffolding in that way. Other things to think about is for science and social studies, especially, join that general education classroom when possible. I went down, I went down the hallway, and my fourth grade year and my seventh grade year, when I had fourth and seventh grade, I went to my fourth grade teacher and I said, "Hey, here are my alternate assessment standards. Johnny and these 4 kids are in your classroom. Here are the standards that they're going to be tested on. Will you be teaching these standards? What time of the year does it fall for you to teach these standards? Are you teaching them in the fall? Are you teaching them in the spring?" And sometimes their format, their time of the year that they taught those standards fell right. So it fell when the gen ed classroom was going to be teaching those lessons. So I could go down and join the gen ed classroom for my students that was a possibility, because I am not a content expert, right? I will say I'm gen ed. I've had all the gen ed elementary age classroom teacher classes, right? But I am not a science expert, but I am an expert at adapting. If you tell me what the lesson needs to look at, I can figure out how to scaffold that lesson for my specific students. I can come up with the AAC for it. I can come up with how can we modify this activity so that we can make it for this student or these students to participate. That I am an expert at. So, when possible, have a conversation with those gen ed teachers, right? Find out because what's the other thing? I don't have I don't have science lab equipment in my special ed classroom, right? Some of these, especially when we're talking about seventh grade and high school, they get into some pretty specialized. I need to burn some things, right? I'm talking about chemical change. I need access to a science lab. I don't have that in my special ed classroom. So, if possible, join that gen ed classroom. Now, it wasn't always possible. I had students that they would very much be, it would not be appropriate. They were going to have a major problem if we went to that gen ed classroom. They were students that being in a classroom with 25 other kids, it wasn't something that was in their repertoire, right? They weren't able to be join, to go down there and do that. They were going to be too stressed out. It was going to be upsetting. They were going to have major behavior issues. So, what's my alternative? What I did in those circumstances were I taught it in my classroom and I borrowed the gen ed teacher's materials. That was a very nice possibility. And some of our science, some of my last school that I was in, their science curriculum had some scaffolded lesson ideas for the content. So their science books came with scaffolded lesson ideas. So I was able to pull those scaffolded lessons and borrow the gen ed teacher classroom materials and pull that back to my special ed classroom and utilize it. Now, when I've hit high school and when I've hit middle school, or I've hit those lessons that they are science lab dependent, I need to make chemical changes. I need to learn about something that I need to go to a science lab for. Then I have worked out with that gen ed teacher for a time that her classroom was empty. Maybe it's her planning period, and I can borrow the science lab, right? I can go down and access that science lab. This is hard, right? And this takes some trust. I've had some science teacher, I've had some responses of science teachers be, I can't leave you alone in my science lab. You might burn it to the ground. And I'm like, you're right. You shouldn't leave me alone. Please stay and help me teach this. Um, so I have had some supervision from some science teachers, but I was totally thankful to have it. So that's what I will say. And I've also hit the point to where I know that I have some teachers who will welcome me with open arms and very generously share materials, share information, be willing to let my kids come down. And I've hit gen ed teachers that wasn't a good fit. They did not enjoy having us. It was not going to be a very good experience for any of us. So I move on from them. And if I have another option, then I try to find it. If I don't, I have went to admin, which is a very unpopular thing, so you can decide what's right for you. I have gone to admin and say, "Hey, here's the standard. Here's what I have to teach it. I've got nothing. Can you help me get whatever?" Um, I have I have in the past, I had some very good luck with borrowing equipment from a younger grade, right? Because the standards, science and social studies standards are not the same, but they build year after year. So kids are exposed to them at a lower level many grades before frequently, right? So I could go back a year or go above a year and borrow. So know those things. Um, Join that gen ed classroom when possible. If not, look at what are your alternatives. I have also done some reverse inclusion. I partnered with our gifted and talented classroom, and some of their students came in. They had like kind of like not really a free period, but they had a study period, and during that study period, they were allowed to go out to other classrooms to do different things. And so I had a small group of gifted and talented kids that would come and we did reverse inclusion. So they came to my classroom and we did different different activities, and one of the activities that we did sometimes were science standards. And so it gave me a group of other kids, and it gave me a resource and a tool and a classroom that I could borrow things from. So think outside of the box, maybe. Um, and related to that, there are several places that you can buy direct teaching materials built for special education classrooms related to these science standards. So know all of those things, right? There are options, and we just have to figure out how do we access those? How do we access some of those? All right, that's my soapbox. So starter tips for alternate assessment. I I've already said this, but I put everything back to matching vocabulary, and I'll show some examples of this later on. I put everything back to how can we sort this? And we'll talk about that too. How can we incorporate art? That's a funny thing to think about in science, but when we think about the life cycle, there are some very cool teaching the lesson, but it's a craft. And we made it, or how can we build whatever this is? And we'll talk about that when we get to atomic numbers and atoms. We build some things, right? Use real objects. So 11th grade science, we're looking at rocks, right? Find some rocks, borrow those from your teacher. We all live in Eastern Kentucky. Some of us could go outside for some of those things and find them, right? What are the resources in your community? I would go to my school librarian and I would say, "Hey, here's my science standards. What reading materials do you have related to this?" So she could help me find some life cycle books. She could help me found books on the periodic table. What can we find to to give kids more exposure to these science standards in different formats? What are the resources in your community? So, Forestry Service, 4-H, Fish and Wildlife, Corps of Engineer. We'll talk about how we might utilize them to help us teach some of our science. Resources specific to your community. You all live in Eastern Kentucky. There are diverse resources that you all have specifically that you could figure out, how do we access them? How can we pull them in to come and present some of this information? How do we pull them in to help teach a lesson? Or how can we borrow their material or equipment? What can they support us that will give my students hands-on access? Visit a college campus. For my science standards, we would come to Morehead State, and we would interact with their physics, some of their elementary science, the professor's physics lab. We had all kinds of equipment that I didn't have access to. So we might take a CBI trip, right? Anybody do community-based instruction still? We went on community-based instruction for our science standards. We went on community-based instructions for our social study standards. We took a trip to historic place that connected to our science and our social study standards. So think about, how can we incorporate alternate assessment into some of those things that are maybe a little bit outside of the box. Um, we visited a greenhouse, right? Or maybe those aren't options. Your school doesn't do CBI, and Fish and Wildlife is too far away for you. Video clips, virtual tours. A lot of our kids are very technology oriented. So where can we find a video game related to this? And I have a few different bits that I'll share with you as we go throughout. But there are some pretty cool options that are related out there that we can find in different places if we just kind of think outside of the box. And the goal being that our standards are going to be concrete, right? I want to make this as hands-on, and I want to connect this to real life whenever possible for my students. The more concrete I can make this, the more real life I can make this for my students, then the better chance that I have that they're going to make a connection and hold that information and then be able to produce that for this testing. So same for all kids, right? We all do better, a little bit better with hands-on. I am going to share this. This is not science specific, but I have found that a lot of teachers don't know that it's out there. I guess the information has fallen out of knowledge. This is the Paul V. Sherlock Adapted Literacy Lessons Online. It's a completely free website that has adapted text for students with a variety of disabilities. Paul V. Sherlock has adapted books related to life cycles. They have adapted books related to rocks. They have several books that are related in the science field, right? And they have adapted text, meaning that the words have pictures with them also, and the reading level is adapted down to a lower level. So note that. And you can use this for all kinds of things. I use this for my literature standards. I use this for my social study standards. There are all kinds of books related to all of those fields in there. And this is preschool all the way into adulthood, right? So preschool through high school, you're going to find adapted materials appropriate for your age group. All right. Oh, now I will really talk about science standards. Um, that's all of my soapbox stuff. So I'm gonna talk. Here's what I decided to do. There's no way we could talk about all of the science standards. So I tried to pick a few from each grade level and to kind of give you some examples of what I might do with them and how I might add different things to it. Does everyone know about the Google Drive? I think I shared the Google Drive, and I will drop that into the chat later. There is a Google Drive for alternate assessment that has adapted lessons for every standard, right? It has the materials, it has everything that you need to teach it. So I'm going to show you a little bit of those things, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of things that I found to add to it. So we're going to talk briefly about the life cycle. I think this was probably this testing window that's about to close. But I'm just going to say the life cycle was one of my favorite lessons that I got to teach when I taught elementary age. And its life cycle of all living things. And I'm going to ask, and I wasn't really sure. And I know there's a little bit of a life cycle one that there's a little bit of a human development one that hits in high school age. I didn't know. So when I did this, humans were not included. When I taught this standard, it did not look at the life cycle of a human. I have puberty related resources that show a human going from baby to adulthood. I don't know that that's appropriate or helpful. So I didn't include it because I was not 100% sure how the humans fell into that. All right, so life cycle. One of the things that I did with life cycle was uh, there are 100,000, maybe not 100,000. There are many different free lessons on Teacher Pay Teachers. That's what that link is to a whole list of life cycle worksheets, life cycle activities. One of the things that we did in my classroom with life cycle was we actually partnered with our local 4-H and we grew chicks. Anybody ever grown chicks in your classroom? It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of chaos, but it was also a lot of fun. And I will tell you the years that I have done that with my students to where we watched our eggs for 21, 22 days. 4-H came and they brought us the warmer, the egg warmer and the automatic rotator, and we watered our eggs, all the things that you do to make chicks grow. Um, my students scored significantly better on alternate assessment because we had done it, right? They had they had been through the life cycle of a chick. I have also seen teachers grow butterflies, right, and be very successful with that. I saw a really cool connection to our fish hatcheries. I don't know if southeastern Kentucky, if well, far eastern Kentucky has a fish hatchery in their region. We have a fish hatchery located near us, and they will bring you eggs, fish eggs, and you can go through the life cycle of a fish and grow yourself some fish from eggs. They were doing that with, I think it was trout eggs, and it was free, right? It didn't cost us anything. When we did 4-H, the only thing that I had to do was I went through, I lived in farmland. I went through my teacher friends and I said, hey, anybody have, a spare 20 dozen, not 20 dozen, but 20 fertilized eggs. And so the 4-H brought me the equipment. We set it up in the back part of my classroom. And we grew chicks. Once they hatched, we kept them in the classroom for about 2 or 3 days, maybe, and let the kids see the chicks. And then we had a plan for where all of those chicks would go to live. So hands-on, if you can make it. Not everybody has the capacity or the desire. Maybe, 20 chicks would be chaos and that would be too much, but there are smaller options. Or maybe you go to models, right? The life cycle models. We're looking at, arts and crafts. Let's build the life cycle of a butterfly. Let's build the life cycle of a frog. Um, Loads of resources that we can do this with. All right, I had to talk about life cycle because it's one of my favorite. Um, so fourth grade science, life science two, which was what is an organism? So an organism is all living things. Where do we find them at? This information comes directly from the Google Drive resource from that was developed, right? Huh, somebody's near Cave. So I'm talking about the Cave Run Lake Fish Hatchery as well. That's the one I was talking about as well. I think there might be, I know they service the whole region, but I don't know if there's one that will be closer for some of the counties that are deeper south. You can also, I know with ours, you can go maybe bringing an animal into your classroom to let it grow sounds horrific, right? And I get that. I totally understand. It was chaos when we did it with ours, but it was such a good hands-on thing. But you can go on a tour, right? You could go on a tour of the fish hatchery, or you could go on a tour of a farm and see baby chicks and see eggs. Maybe you have a friend that has a farm. I have seen some classrooms be successful with that. They have a friend who does have a farm, so they take a CBI trip. They see the eggs that are in the process of hatching. They go back once a week, once every couple of weeks, because eggs are not super exciting for about, it's like 3 weeks there that they're just eggs hanging out. So they go back at the end when they're hatching. So they go and see them as eggs. They go back and see them as they're hatching, or when they've just hatched. So there are some ways that you can kind of adapt and go around it that make a big difference. But it's hands-on, right? And that's the good thing about science is that I can make this, and it's real life. A lot of our kids come from farms, or we live close to the land, is what I will say, right? A deer hunt, we see the life cycle all the time. So that's one of those ones that our kids sometimes can really make that connection with. So this standard is organisms, right? Uh, Inside of that Google Drive, you are going to find two different lessons, and including this like construct this particular one where it kind of breaks down what the standard is. So we're identifying an ecosystem, right? We are looking at habitats. Kentucky has habitats, right? We all live in a specific type of habitat, and we need to understand what adaptation is. So, what is adaptation? How does a species change to become better suited to where it lives at and to survive the environment? This one has, I'm going to show you some of the pieces that we found with it. So the nice thing about inside of that Google Drive is you're going to find ideals for scaffolding. They're the ones down on, as I'm looking at my screen, it's the right side. They're looking at the right side. So the scaffolding thing is have a turtle shell because you're looking at different animals. You're looking at what are organisms, right? What are different animals and what kind of habitats do they live in? When I taught this standard, we went to the visitor center at our local lake. Right. I live pretty near Cave Run Lake. And so we went to our visitor center. We met with the Forestry Service. I know that you guys are bound to have forestry service in your area. Um, I know that there are things like that out there besides just in my region. We went to the Forestry Service. One of the displays that they had up for about 15 years was an animal in its habitats. So they had different stuffed animals, so actual animals that had been killed and stuffed, and then they had actual stuffed animals, so like a stuffy bear, right? They had a turtle inside of a turtle habitat, and we would go and we would take a little tour um, of that particular area and just look at those animals in those habitats. They suggest maybe getting a birdhouse. That's one of the ideals for scaffolding, right? Get a birdhouse and a bird nest. That's easily accessible. Everywhere you go, you got birds, right? How can we put a bird feeder up? They have some really cool ones. I'm going to say for my mother-in-law, when she first had dementia, we found one of those. bird feeders that are clear and they attach to the window. And we would put bird food so the birds would come directly to the window, right? So it'd bring those animals in, something to consider for your school. Some of the things that I did within this lesson. So this is the Google Drive that Stephanie shared. And when you get in there, this is what it should look like, right? And so these are the resources that you're going to find already cultivated for you. You don't need to do anything but access them, kind of explore and go through. It has the lessons, it has the materials that you are going to use as your practice examples. So this is phenomenal. Now, when I did alternate assessment, there was nothing like this way back in the Stone Ages. And we're just talking 10 years ago. You were kind of, they gave you the standards and it was like, good luck, do your best. So it's really, I hope it's really, I just wanted to make sure that you know that this is out there. So this is the scaffolding examples. Forgive my terrible pictures and my terrible cutting out of things. So one of the things that it shows that it provides with you are some different animals and different habitats. This is an elephant. I'm going to say it's Africa. That's my guess. So this is the habitat of Africa. One of the things that I would add to this, and when I taught this, was we didn't have these particular resources, but I would look at an elephant lives here, but also a rhinoceros might live here. Also, we might find what are other animals that live in Africa? Why do they live in Africa? Well, it's very hot there. The elephant has big ears because it fans itself, right? Long trunk because it can access water that's maybe low, a low level of water that it can get access to more easily. Um, where are our habitat, right? We all live in Eastern Kentucky. You probably have a park. You probably have some sort of forested area. You may have a forested area on your school. I see a lot of schools that have a pond or some sort of outdoor classroom area, or some sort of, I see ponds. I've even seen like wetland areas. This is a great opportunity to go outside and what animals are living there? Why do they live there? What about the way that they're built helps them to survive in that particular habitat? So this is just a great place that we are kind of exposing kids. A part of that standard is create a new species and identify what it needs to live in its habitat. This one is fun. So this is the jackalope. Not sure if you all know what a jackalope is, but it's a famed creature. It's a famed creature that's been around for a long time. When we did this with my students drew, we drew the picture of it, if they could draw, or for my students that drawing was not an option, we got magazine pictures of different animals or different printouts, and we cut them apart and then let them glue back together one. And then we talked about what part of it helped it to thrive in its habitat. What kind of habitat did it live in? I had a student who created a fish. They created a fish that also had big ears, and the fish could swim to the top of the surface here if there were fishermen. Fair enough, right? Uh, think about how do we access resources in our community, right? Those were some of the things that we tried to do for my students. And to me, science is fun, right? There's so many ways that I can make this hands-on. There's so many ways that I can incorporate. I can pull in art. I can pull in, maybe I'm doing construction and we're building something. We're going on a trip to see something. And maybe that trip is just out to the parking lot. I've not been in all of the schools in the KVEC region, but I've been in a lot of them. And I know a lot of your schools is bordered by a small forest, a small pond, a grass area. Go out there and look and see what kind of creatures you find. Um, Talk about that habitat and why those creatures live there. If you go on longer field trips, this is called Salado. Has anyone ever gone on a field trip to Salado? It's Salto. It's in Frankfurt. It's been around for several years, at least more than 20. And it is a Kentucky specific zoo. I think it cost under $5 a kid to go there. It's not as big as like Louisville Zoo, although a zoo trip could be a potentially great, any of those kind of trips, you could look at the habitat and make a connection to. But Think about that. How can I make an opportunity to go and see a habitat in my area? If you have the ability to go on a longer trip, Salado is a great place to learn about Kentucky habitats. They have lots of live animals. They have lots of different examples of native species to Kentucky that you can go and see, including some bears and elk and some of the larger species outside and fish. So it's very cool, but maybe Salato's too far. I know Frankfurt is a long, long way for some of you. What do you have in your region? Do you have a farm? Maybe you can go and visit the farm and learn about the habitat of the farm. Maybe you can go and look for things in your area. When I taught in Menifee County, there was a buffalo field, right? We would get on the CBI bus and we would go over the hill. We'd go over not, we didn't really have mountains, we have foothills, right? We would go over the hill to the big field and visit the buffalo. There wasn't anything else out there but the buffalo, but we talked about what does the buffalo need to live? It needs water, right? It needs a large grassy area. It needs less predators. So I looked at how can we make connections to our local area. So these are some of my favorite. Maybe you have a creek, right? Or a pond, a fish pond, near your school. How can you go and incorporate those pieces for your students? All right. So physical science. This is another, I believe, fourth grade standard. So we're looking at how do we investigate and classify different types of materials by their observable pieces. So I'm looking at something, some sort of object, some sort of material. How can I classify that? To me, I did structured teaching all the time. This is a sort activity, right? I am sorting things based on a specific category and I'm teaching students how might they sort items. This is totally hands-on. I'm bringing in I'm bringing in like fidget toys, right? For my students, we're going to bring in sensory pieces. We're going to bring in fidget type items, and we're going to learn how do we classify different fidgets and different those types of items. Maybe this is rocks. If I want some other kind of material, I could bring in wood. I mean, the sky is the limit of what I'm going to do. And then inside of that Google Drive, this is their scaffolded work sample that they provide you is here's a column and they're suggesting a stapler, a teddy bear, a quarter, and a pillow, right? And then you're deciding how are you classifying the items in column one? How are you classifying the items in column two? What I like about those work samples is that it gives me an idea. Maybe I don't want to use those materials at all. Maybe I use this for one lesson, but then on a different lesson, I pull in my sensory materials. On a different lesson, I pull in different materials. So we're exposing kids to this a few different times so that they have an opportunity to be exposed to the science standard. All right, grade 7. If you are a middle schooler, this is your grade. Grade 7, my hardest year, I had fourth graders and I had seventh graders, and seventh grade was in a different building. So I couldn't walk down the hallway to get access to my seventh grade science teacher or my seventh grade science material. So we have really had to think through how I was supporting those students because their gen ed peers were in a totally different building. So I really had to think that through. So this standard is Newton's first law, and it is know that the motion of an object is determined by the net force. Know that any object, a larger force causes a larger change in motion. So the bigger something is, the bigger that change in motion will be. Plan an investigation to show evidence that a change in the object's motion depends on the net force of the object and the mass, right? So I'm looking at how am I changing? I'm doing some investigation here, right? I've got some different objects of different size, and inside of that Google Drive, they are giving you a work sample and they're showing you how you might set up, or you can use this directly. What materials do we need? How are we using these materials to investigate our questions about force, mass, and motion? And I'm going to show you. So here's some of the things that we did. We, I don't know, I'm just going to say, I'm going to put this out here, but I'm not sure if they're very common anymore. Anyone's school still have force and motion kits, right? There used to be force and motion kits. They should still be around. I don't know if they're commonly used anymore. I don't know if we've moved away from that. I haven't seen teachers use them, but I'm maybe not necessarily there when they teach force and motion. We accessed a force and motion kit, right? One of the things that we did for this was we took different objects and we then taped items to them to make them have more weight or mass, right? So if you don't have a force and motion kit, not a problem, right? This is my Hot Wheels ramp, right? I got myself a Hot Wheels ramp. You can pick this up at a yard sale. Or if you have boys, you can maybe find this down in your toy room. They make some that have some really nice little a really nice little multiple car racetrack. And so for this, we played. I pulled my students and we pulled cars. And so we sent the cars down the track with no weights on them. And then we sent the cars down the track with different coins on them, which we taped to the top of them. So we changed the weight, right? So we added weight, we took weight away to see which cars go down the track the fastest, right? And it should probably be the car that weighs the most, unless there's something else happening. You don't necessarily have to use Hot Wheels. You could make any kind of incline ramp. I made an incline ramp out of just a couple of pieces of 2x4s side by side, and have slid objects down, changing the weight, changing the size, and we're just experimenting. And we're using something like this particular data collection sheet is what I'm going to call it, to make our work sample. So what materials do we have? How are we using this? And it goes on in and it gives you a place to put, here is my car or here's my object. Here's how much weight I put on it. I taped 3 pennies. I taped a quarter. I taped, 4 quarters. Which one is winning the race, right? That's kind of the way that we go with it. The other thing that it gives you is um, it suggests balls, right? A lot of our students enjoy playing with balls. This might be a good place if you have. I have seen this done at a bowling alley. Has anyone ever been to a bowling alley and there are the bowling balls weigh different weights. So they already are come weighted. If you're familiar with bowling, you can get a 6 pound ball, you can get a 14 pound ball, you can get a 10 pound ball, and they even have ramps that you can roll the ball down. So we went on a CBI trip and we rented a lane and I got them to give me 2 or 3 of the ramps of the ball ramps and we lined them up side by side and we put different weighted balls in and we rolled them down to see which ones went fastest, which ones accelerated the easiest. Uh, just experimenting hands-on to kind of answer these questions. And you can use different size balls. I mean, the sky's the limit of what you might take away and do with this. So just a few ideas. Thinking about how do I make this hands-on? How do I make this accessible for all of my students? And how do I pull in real life concrete objects to help them make the connections to the standard for all of my students? All right. So next standard is defining physical property, define chemical property. We are analyze and interpret the data of properties of substances before and after the substances interact to determine if a chemical reaction has happened. So now we need to burn some things, right? Maybe we're burning sugar, steel wool. Maybe they suggest fat reacting with sodium hydroxide and mixing zinc. Anybody have sodium hydroxide just sitting around? No, probably not, right? We're going to need some support here. Right. Sorry, Stephanie. We're going to need some support here, right? We're going to need to go down to our science teacher. The cool thing about this is that when I called up my 7th grade science teacher and I said, hey, here's the standard. Here are what they are suggesting. How would you, a lot of times the first response that I got when I talked to my gen ed teacher was, I have no idea how you will teach that to your students. And I'm like, that's okay. Tell me, how do you teach this to your students? Right. And I know we should be saying they're all our students and they should all be our students, but how do you teach this standard to gen ed kids? And then I can try to figure out how we scaffold it. And I can maybe borrow your sodium hydroxide. I'm not even sure quite what that is, but we're going to borrow it, okay? So know those things. Know that this is a good place to get some partner and some support. Some of the examples that they do here are evidence of physical change. So the first part of it is physical change. So we're changing the appearance of it. This one to me is hands-on. We're going to rip some paper. I have students who would be abjectly happy if we came in and the lesson today was to tear some stuff up. So we're going to rip some paper. How did it change? We're going to melt some ice. We're going to crush a bottle. Maybe you're going to tear jeans. Maybe you're not going to tear jeans. You're going to think about what are some things that I can show a physical change for. And then we're going to describe what that might look like. And then the next part of this is our chemical change. The chemical change gets a little bit harder, but they have some phenomenal suggestions that you can access and use. So vinegar and baking soda, if you haven't made a volcano, I mean, come on. It was one of my when my son was very young and I needed him something for him to occupy when he was about 3 years old and I was trying to do my graduate school homework, I would dump out baking soda on a cookie sheet that had an edge on it, and I would give him an eyedropper and vinegar, and he would make tiny volcanoes for, at least an hour. Um, so lots of good hands-on opportunities here. Hot hands. If you hunt or live outdoors any at all, you have probably accessed hot hands. With hot hands, you open up the package, it exposes it to the air, and now the package gets warmer. So we are seeing an evidence of a chemical exchange. Burning a birthday candle. Kids would enjoy that. That would be a simple one to do. Making milk sour. In this context, they're making milk sour, I believe, with vinegar. We can grab a milk carton from down in the lunchroom, pour it into a glass, and we can use that vinegar left over from our baking soda experiment. Burning paper. I'm gonna say burning things gives me the heebie-jeebies with kids sometimes. So you guys can decide if that's appropriate for your students or not. Um, I would say err on the side of safety. Err on the side of safety, seriously. But thinking about how can we show chemical changes? Your Lots of options there, lots of places that we can go through there with that.
Kim, I shared the elephant toothpaste because that's my favorite, where it does the big, huge glob that comes out. It is just so great. And my kids loved it because just like the volcano where it kind of blows up. And the elephant toothpaste doesn't require a lot. It's like Dawn dishwashing liquid, some hydrogen peroxide. And I think, let's see, yeah, hydrogen and active yeast. You can get that really quickly at, Food City or at even just the dollar store, really. So good stuff.
I love that, right? And it's hands-on, and kids, our students tend to do better with that, right? Something that they can wrap their heads around and kind of make more accessible for them. So I will take elephant toothpaste for sure.
The other one that's in the packet that I shared was the aging of apples. And so that one's using the lemon juice and an apple and a little bit of baking soda, and you age the apples. So that's another good one that they've got in their packet that I just shared with them. So if they're using that, it gives them exactly what is happening and how to explain it. So I thought that was a good way for them to be able to start to look at different ways, and even seltzer, the reaction the seltzer does.
The Coke and the Oh, Coke and the Mentos, right? Some of those, there's a lot of good choices with that. And the cool thing about the information inside of that Google Drive is I like how when it hits into the high school standards and it hits into some of the middle school standards, there is scaffolding for the adults, that it explains that science standard in details because I need the details of what we're specifically trying to teach here. I'm not a science content expert, especially not a high school science content expert. Um, it always makes me feel a little bit intimidated. But let's talk about high school science content. Rocks. Let's talk about rocks. Earth Science 2 is please conduct an investigation of the properties of water and its effect on earth materials and surface. I'm going to say this one kind of got me excited. I live in I live in a cliffy area, and I know I have been in some of your school parking lots that have a rock facing, and there are rock facings that have the water pockmarks, right? If you know what I'm talking about. They have, you can see the evidence of the rain and the freezing and the different weather effects on the rocks right out in your schoolyard. I know I won't name some of those schools, but I know I've been in some of those schools that have those kind of rock features right out in the parking lot or right out on the backside of the school that you could easily just walk to and kind of look at it and let kids see, hey, this really happens. Where I live at, we have a lot of cliff facings and a lot of really cool rock features that have came from this whole the water and its effect of earth materials. So this starts out with identifying different types of rock. So the sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous rocks, and then explain the process that occur in the rock cycle. So weathering, compaction, cementation, heating, and cooling. Uh, so the cool thing about this is for me, I'm turning these and I talked about it a little bit earlier. How do we introduce vocabulary? I'm taking these pictures that they have provided inside of the lessons, and I am printing them out and I am turning them into file folder matching. We're going to talk about sedimentary rocks. Here is a picture. Here are I could do this with actual rocks. I don't know if you're, maybe my family is weird, but we all have collected rocks over the years, pretty rocks. I mean, not for any more reason than, gosh, this is a pretty rock. And anybody else a pretty rock collector? Right? I think it has to be an Eastern Kentucky habit. I know we kayak, and when my son was very young, he brought back probably on the way back from a trip. He's like, he was really struggling to paddle his boat and keep up. Well, he had probably 25 pounds of rock in his boat that he had added in. So think about your pretty rocks. And we might not have igneous rocks. Lava rocks are probably less likely to find in our area, but sedimentary rocks and metamorphic rocks we will possibly find. So when I have supported schools through this, we make a sort. So here is sedimentary rocks, here are metamorphic rock, here are igneous rocks, and I'm having kids sort them based on their properties, right? On their physical appearance, on the things that we know about rocks. If you're not a rock collector, borrow them from your science department. Your ninth grade or 10th grade, your science teacher at your high school, you know they have a rock collection. Get them to let you access that or find out where they got it from. If borrowing theirs is not a good option, figure out where they got that from and start your own rock collection. Maybe if physical rocks aren't safe or they're not an option for you, do pictures of rocks and then have real rocks where you can. Um, there is a good lesson of they use crayons. I can't say it right, you all. I have no idea where I got that from, but I'm crayon. I'm crayons deficient. So they have a good example of a hands-on experiment to where you're using the crayon rock cycle. And I'm going to show you a couple of other options with that in a second. But I put this in here. This is the lesson two scaffolding work sample. These are vocabulary words that they are attempting to teach. Porous, big, tiny. Um, I would use those pictures, and I'm exposing my students way before 11th grade to the vocabulary word of big, tiny, porous, right? I'm exposing them to those vocabulary words, hopefully for a few years before we get to the standard so that they will be familiar with them. Maybe I'm using those pictures and turning it into a match. Maybe I'm using those pictures up to remind myself to make connections to things that are big, things that are tiny, things that are porous, so that students have some sort of concept of what the vocabulary is. Um, I found a couple of really cool rock cycle. So I found a rock cycle with starburst candy, and it will take you through the process of weather erosion. And that video is not very long. And then you're just getting starburst candy and some water and a couple of other really inexpensive materials. And then the bottom one is about 50 different rock cycle experiments. So with food or with Play-Doh. So if you're a person who doesn't like to use food in lessons, then there is a Play-Doh option. It also has some built-in games. So if you have students who like video game type stuff, there are some educational video game options built inside of that that were all free, that I thought were pretty cool and that gave some options for different rock cycles. All right. This one is, oh, atomic. Okay, so this one is physical science. It is, all right, so this one is um, construct and revise an explanation for the outcome of simple chemical reactions based on the outermost electron states of atoms, trends in the periodic table, and knowledge of patterns of chemical properties, right? This is a doozy one. So they want you to identify that the periodic table is made up of an element. So I need to know what an element is. I need to know what an atom is, and that an atom is made up of electrons, protons, neutrons. Um, I need to know what molecules are, compounds, and it's a long list of things that I need to know here. This particular one has some really good adult help, right? And the adult help is all of the pink. When you go inside of that Google Drive, if you are a high school teacher, go inside of that Google Drive and it has inside of those lessons are specific information for adults explaining all of this. So this is the periodic table. It has, I found the picture that I found, I think is one that's in there, and it has examples of items that come from these materials. We know that the periodic table is made up of elements, and everything on Earth that we use or that we are comes from this table, right? We all come from different makeups, different sets of elements. Um, but I think it's really important as a special ed teacher. I'm not a science content expert. So what they have done is they built in scaffolding for the adults, which is critical, I would say, especially for my own self. For I will just speak for myself. For myself, for me, myself, and I, that scaffolding is really important to help me to understand the science, this what this particular lesson is asking me to do, so that I am able then to scaffold that for my students. This is inside of the work sample. One of the things that I did with this or would do with this, and I've seen students do with this, are they have turned the periodic table into a file folder and they are matching pieces of it, right? Some of this is part of this lesson is identifying the makeup and the set of the periodic table. So we did a file folder with it. I didn't put individual pieces, but I did it in chunks to where the kids are matching the chunks back to it. And then we could talk about this is the things. These are the things, the elements and where they come from. This one that was back here, this particular table, this particular version of the periodic table, it does a nice job of making a connection to a real life object. If I just talked about helium, but the kids have no idea what helium is, but if I said the helium is in the pink, on the right side of that periodic table at the top, it's the balloons, but I can make a connection that helium is in a balloon, right? So my goal is to help them make a connection to real life items. So this table is helpful to me as the adult to help make those connections to what and where they might find that in real life. Another part of this lesson is making up atoms and atomic models. In the classrooms that I've supported and when I helped teach this, uh, we made models. So you can make this in a couple of ways. There's an example of one that is made up of M&Ms or Starburst, and they have just used paper plates to represent different structures of that. And then the one at the top, whoop, whoop, go back. The one at the top of the screen is atomic model cards. Now that cost about $4, unfortunately, but it did a really nice job of giving you your different protons and the different neutrons required. And it has a nice feature that you could balance it. The other thing that I liked about that was that it was it was made out of non-food items, right? If you're somebody who doesn't like to incorporate food into these types of things, it was made up of just arts and crafts material. But it gave you a place to talk about protons and neutrons and how they balance. So those are some things that you could use. Also, uh, you needed to show a part of this was showing different pieces of chemical reactions. And so I thought table salt, right? Table salt, all kids, we all like salt. We like salt way more than we should like salt. So I picked salt. And this is a video of how to make salt. I'm not going to do this in my classroom, is what I'm going to say, right? I don't, if I am going to do this particular experiment in person, then I'm going to have to go to a science lab and borrow some help. Once we get to Bunsen burners and those types of things, they're a little bit intimidating to me and a little bit frightening, but maybe they're not for you. And if that's awesome. But for me, I'm going to go to a YouTube video and we're going to watch it be made in that context. And that's going to be I picked salt because I figured we could all just eat something salty afterwards. All right, so this is another standard that you need to teach is grade 11. It is evaluate claims and evidence and reasoning that complex interactions in the ecosystems maintain relatively consistent numbers and types of organisms in stable conditions, but changing conditions may result in a new ecosystem. So basically what this means is that um, changes in the ecosystems change how many people or animals that it can support or organisms. I'm going to say animals, but so small changes or big changes change the environment. And then once we've changed the environment, then that changes whether or not we can support life of any kind on it. So this is both human interactions and nature. So this looks at, we could talk about this in the context of hunting, right? Um, I'm a deer hunter. We hunt for many different reasons, but one of the reasons that we hunt is because population control. If we have too many deer or too many whatever animal, then they'll starve, right? There'll be too many animals that and the environment that there cannot support it, right? Um, Seasonal flooding, Lord have mercy, right? Poor Eastern Kentucky. You all have been hit, right? Maybe it's extreme changes like volcanic eruptions or rising sea levels. Their example that they suggested and I really liked was the Lorax, right? So I'm the Lorax, I speak for the trees. So he was trying to save the trees, and and by saving the trees, he was saving the creatures and all of the things that lived in the tree, right? So they gave many different examples. I tried to figure out another book. So this is one that you could definitely connect to real life, and you guys can decide what's appropriate or what's not appropriate. When I have talked about this, when I've had a lot of boys that hunted, we talked about this in the context of hunting. When that wasn't the case, then we talked about it in other contexts. You can definitely find uh, I have done video tours of Hawaii and we've looked at volcanic eruptions and looked at the path of that, especially making a connection to our porous, our rocks. Some of those rocks, the lava rocks that come from that region. Um, I've talked about adaptations, and this standard connects all the way back to fourth grade, right? We talked about habitats and environments. We talked about those pieces. So they stack, right? So they stack. They're exposed at a fourth grade level. They're a little bit exposed at seventh grade level. They're a little bit exposed at 11th grade. And then at 11th grade, they're asking them to think about if we're making changes in the environment, if how does that affect or effect all of the things that live there is for the good or for the bad. I do really think science is one of those that you can make hands-on, and any time that you can get support from your gen ed science teacher, that is 100% the way to go. And my best approach is don't ask them how they would teach the standard to your student. Ask them how they would teach the standard to their gen ed kids.